Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, before beginning this debate, I would like to say a few words about you. You are coming to the end of your mandate as Speaker of the House, and I would like to say something about the affection and respect that we all have for you. Your decisions and have marked the history of our country.
Sometimes with a modest rebuke, sometimes with the sharp sting of focused argument, to understand, to respect, and to cherish the rules of Canadian democracy, and for that, your citizens will always hold you in highest honor. Mr. Speaker, this is a historic day in the life of Canadian democracy, the democracy that you have served so well. I have to inform the House that the official opposition has lost confidence in the government. Le gouvernement ne jouit.
The government no longer has the confidence of the official opposition.
To agree with the finding in the 27th report of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs presented on the 21st of March. This was a historic finding, Mr. Speaker. It was the first time that a parliamentary committee has found the government in contempt. Today, with this motion, we ask the House to do the same, to find the government in contempt, and to withdraw the confidence of the House.
With this motion, we are asking members to condemn the government for contempt of Parliament and, as a result, to withdraw their confidence in this House. This is an important moment, Mr. Speaker, in the history of Canadian democracy, but also this is an opportunity to affirm our attachment to parliamentary democracy and its fundamental principles. What principles are we speaking about and referring to? Well, that the government must offer the members all information that they find necessary in order to keep the executive accountable before the Canadian people.
Debate goes to the heart of parliamentary democracy. The obligation of a government to provide members of this House with the information they need in order to hold the government accountable to the people of Canada. We are the people's representatives. When the government spends money, the people have a right to know what it is to be spent on. This Parliament does not issue blank checks. For 4 months, the opposition asked the government to tell the Canadian people the true cost of their budget plans. For 4 months, we demanded to know how much Canadian taxpayers were being asked to pay for fighter jets, for prisons, and for corporate tax breaks. For 4 months, this House and the Canadian people were stonewalled by this government, and they are being stonewalled still. Pendant 4 mois.
For 4 months, we have asked the government for accounts, and for 4 months, we asked for the real costs of the jet fighters, of prisons, and of the corporate tax cuts for major corporations. For 4 months, we received no answer, but only just the contempt and arrogance of this government. And even today, we haven't received an answer. Mr. Speaker, we were shocked, but we were not surprised. After all, this is the same government that shut down Parliament twice, the same government that was forced by one of your rulings to deliver the documents relating to Afghan detainees, and we're still waiting to see those documents.
The Afghan documents, the government's excuse for withholding the truth was national security. In the case of the budget documents, they invented something about cabinet confidence, but actually they didn't even bother with an excuse at all. But you would have none of it. You held that the rules of our democracy require the government to answer the questions that Parliament wants answered. You sent the matter back to a committee for action, and they came back with a finding of contempt. So this is why we are where we are today. The House must decide whether the government has broken a basic rule of our democracy, and therefore whether it can remain in office. For our part, on this side of the House, there is no doubt. You have spoken, Mr. Speaker, the committee has spoken, and now the House must speak with a clear voice. And it must say that a government that breaks the rules and conceals facts from the Canadian people does not deserve to remain in office. La Chambre doit dire.
The House must speak clearly. A government that does not respect democracy does not deserve to remain in power. Enough is enough. If the result of this vote is an election, the Canadian people will have the opportunity to replace an arrogant government with a government that does respect democracy.
An election is unnecessary. We reply, we did not seek an election. But if we need one to replace a government that doesn't respect democracy with one that does, I can't think of a more necessary election. But, Mr. Speaker, it is not just democracy that this House will be called upon to affirm this afternoon. This House should also affirm Canadians' hunger, nay, their longing for change. It's time to change Canada's direction, time to get us on the right path. After 5 years of Conservative government, it's time to say enough is enough. Enough of the politics of fear. Enough of the politics of division. Enough of the politics of personal destruction. Assez, c'est assez.
Enough is enough.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, look at the priorities of this government. It proposes to spend 1,000 times more on jet fighters than on help to students who are doing post-secondary education. As to its priorities, we say no. They're offering less to seniors over the whole year than what they spent in a single day on the G20 summit. We say no to that waste. The government proposes to spend 1,000 times more on prisons than on crime prevention among youth. We say no, and no again. This government's priorities do not reflect the priorities of Canadian families. Enough is enough.
Government laid bare in that thin gruel that we saw earlier in this week reveal a government out of touch and out of control. There is no credible plan to tackle the deficit because there are no numbers any reasonable person can believe in. There is no vision of how to sustain our healthcare system. There is not a word about affordable housing, not a word about childcare, and nothing for the pressing needs of Canadian families in poverty. Instead, we get jets, jails, and giveaways to oil companies, insurance companies, and banks who are doing just fine, thank you very much. So we need a change. We need to focus scarce resources where they really matter. Early learning and childcare, college and university education for all, especially for Aboriginal and immigrant Canadians, energy efficiency and green jobs, family care for our loved ones in the home, and security and dignity in retirement. All of this, plus a clear plan to clean up our country's finances and get us back to balance without adding to the tax burden on Canadian families. Mr. Speaker, these are the priorities of our people. These are the needs that we must serve. These are the priorities at home. But let us not forget the priorities abroad. We have so much ground to catch up. We have a government that has lost our place in the world and lost our place at the Security Council of the United Nations. We need a government that restores our honour, our credit, and our prestige on the international stage. A government that understands the deep and committed internationalism that dwells in the hearts of all Canadian citizens. Enfin, Monsieur le Président.
Lastly, Mr. Speaker, we need a government for the citizens, accountable to the citizens, in the service of citizens and of democracy. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I always get back to democracy. Members of this government have been accused of election fraud. Someone close to the Prime Minister is accused of influence peddling. That's enough, Mr. Speaker. We can't stand this anymore.
To democracy, to the abuse of power. We have a government whose most senior members stand accused of electoral fraud. We have a Prime Minister who appointed as his top advisor someone who served prison time for stealing money from his clients, someone who now faces accusations of influence peddling and is under an RCMP investigation. Canadians look at that picture and they say, we have had enough. This House has had enough. Enough of the abuse of power, of the abus de pouvoir, enough of the bad economic choices, les mauvais choix économiques.
Bad economic choices.
Unique distinctions, Mr. President. We have a government with the largest deficit in Canadian history. It is the highest spending government in Canadian history. It is the most wasteful government in Canadian history. And finally, it is the first government in Canadian history to face a vote of contempt in this House. This is a government and a Prime Minister that is out of touch and is out of control. It is time for a change. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, I call on all members of Parliament to support our motion.
House to support our motion. Merci. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened with great interest to my colleagues' remarks, and I just want to remind this House and Canadians about the process that was followed. Mr. Speaker, you referred.
Order, Mr. Speaker.
With all due respect, Mr. Speaker, I didn't say a word during the comments. I would appreciate the same.
Get your caucus in line, Iggy.
Mr. Speaker, you referred this message, you referred this issue to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and you said it was a prima facie breach of privilege. That means, Mr. Speaker, that on the surface it appears like there was a breach of privilege. You referred that to the committee. I had the honour and the privilege of sitting on that committee during a constituency week when we should have been back in our ridings. Mr. Speaker, we listened to some great input at that committee. We heard from Mel Cap. We heard from a number of our ministers. We heard from many other witnesses during that 2 days of hearings and then another day for another matter. But, Mr. Speaker, the problem is that the decisions of that committee, which should have been made after the input was received, the decisions were made long before the committee ever met. At the end of the committee, the committee was presented with the demands of the coalition opposition, and the demands were this. There will be a maximum of 2 pages in the report. 2 days of hearings, 2 pages of report. Unbelievable. What's worse, Mr. Speaker, they demanded that there be no summary of evidence presented at the meetings to the final House of Commons. Mr. Speaker, we can talk about democracy. We can talk about the contempt of parliamentary process. But I would ask my honourable colleague, is not the process that the Procedure and House Affairs Committee went through for 3 days here in Ottawa not a contempt of the parliamentary privilege of the members of this House?
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member from Kitchener-Conestoga for his public service on that committee, but I would draw to his attention a point in my speech was that this House asked for 4 months for the documents necessary for a Parliament to make up its mind about the budget. The member from Kitchener-Conestoga waves a binder in my face. Let me remind him the answers that we sought were not in those documents. We have been stonewalled for 4 months. The issue about who is to blame for contempt of Parliament lays squarely on the side of a government that, when asked to provide the information necessary for the citizens of Canada to evaluate a budget, they stonewalled, they objected, they refused, they did not comply. This raises a fundamental issue of respect for parliamentary institutions. The facts remain as I have stated. You cannot say that this government is in compliance when those binders do not provide the information required and when for 4 months you gave us no answer at all.
The honourable member for Skeena, Bulkley Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's with some sadness that I think we should all be involved in this debate today, because while it is an historic moment that a government of Canada is being found in contempt of not just Parliament, but in contempt of the Canadian people. Because we all come here in an effort to represent those constituents back home, and when a government does this, and the list of concerns, serious allegations, and some of them being founded by the public prosecutor charging 4 Conservatives, 2 likely to go to jail, cancelling the long-form census, the firing of independent government officers and agents who are meant to hold government to account. And it concerns me that just last night we received a leaked email from the Minister of Industry who instructed his Senate colleagues to kill the generic bill for drugs to Africa. Very similar to how this government instructed its people in the Senate to kill the Climate Change Accountability Act passed by the leader of the NDP. Now, to the member from Etobicoke Lakeshore, it seems to me that for a government to be found in contempt, if it's never happened before, we've had bad governments in this country before, we've had lying governments in this country before, we've had contemptuous governments in this country before. For this government to achieve this low bar of ethics and morality, how is it that we find ourselves in this place, and what must we all do collectively to never allow this to happen again?
The honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member from Skeena Bulkley Valley for his insightful remarks. He points out that we are here today because of a long pattern of abuse. Not simply the withholding of documents on this particular occasion, though we have spent 4 long months in vain seeking the documents we need to do our job, but there is a longer pattern of abuse that goes back to the shutting down of Parliament on 2 occasions. When the Government of Canada was under pressure, facing criticism and just criticism from members of this House, they chose to prorogue. Canadians did not like that. It set the pattern of contempt, the pattern of disrespect, the pattern of abuse of our democracy that brings us to this place. The member for Skeena Bulkley Valley asks me asks our side what we can do about it. That is why we are here today, to present a motion before this House that holds this government in contempt. If we do not do this, if we allow this to pass, if we allow the government to get away with this, we will endanger the democracy which is incarnated by this beautiful room. Il faut absolument qu'on soit clair.
We have to be absolutely clear on this issue. What do we need to do to raise the bar, to have democracy respected? That is to support and pass the motion by the Liberal Party of Canada, the official opposition.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments?
Member for. The honourable member for Vancouver Quadra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The strength of the country that we love is our people, but it's also the principles and practices of our democracy. People have worked for, we have fought for, and people have died for our democracy and our country. Now this government has broken the basic rules of democracy, and that's being expressed in the vote of contempt of Parliament that's happening today in the House of Commons. So I would like to ask the Leader of the official opposition, how does this government's abuses of power and contempt of Parliament affect the very character of Canada, and how does it affect the day-to-day lives of people in their homes and their communities in Canada?
Question. The honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I thank my colleague from Vancouver Quadra, a colleague and friend. She asks a question that essentially transports us out of the precincts of this House and asks what this means to ordinary Canadians, to families watching at home, people at work. This is a question that affects them directly. Many Canadians enjoy the very special privilege of rich and lucky countries, of not having to think and worry about their democracy. They entrust its protection to their representatives. They do not think about whether their democracy is in danger. They don't look up from the more important things they have to do in their lives. Getting the kids to hockey practice, getting the kids to school, doing their jobs, being with their neighbors and friends. But in the background, in the deep background of their lives, there must always be a confidence that their democracy works and that it works for them. And that when members of this House ask a government questions about how their money, taxpayers' money, is spent, they get an honest answer. That is the crux of our democratic system. That on behalf of the woman taking her son or daughter to hockey practice, on behalf of the man going to work in the mill, they can count on us in the House of Commons to ask the questions that those citizens need to know in order to hold our government accountable. And when that government fails in this most elementary task of democratic freedom, it is the duty of the members of this House to bring this government down.